All right, so today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the ways in which society responded to the Industrial Revolution. And in particular, we're going to be looking at four types of responses: Romanticism, which is a literary and artistic style; realism, which is also a artistic or literary style, and we'll be looking at two types of those, and we're going to couple those together. And then we're going to look at economic systems. We're going to be looking at capitalism, in particular industrial capitalism, which I'll discuss in a few moments. And then on the other side of that, we're going to talk about socialism, which comes a bit later. And in order to look at those topics together, we're going to be comparing them and sort of seeing how realism is a response to romanticism, and then how socialism is a response to capitalism, industrial capitalism. So let's start by looking at why these happen when they do. So why is society responding in these ways to the Industrial Revolution? Well, it's largely because populations are growing in the 19th century. Populations are expanding and there are more people living in urban environments. And naturally, people are going to want to respond to the terrible things that they are experiencing. So what you have happening as a result is you have writers and public intellectuals, academics, professors at universities coming together and starting to criticize the things that they are doing. So you have that happening. Along with that, you also have people trying to make sense of the things that are going on in their lives. Nature is being destroyed, cities are growing, populations are booming, and people are getting concerned about the larger environment. There's also a larger readership, right? So if you are a person who wants to write a book, well, there's now a new market for you to sell those things to. But by the mid 19th century, by the mid 1800s, 77% of women and 90% of men are literate, meaning you now have a large group of people to whom you can sell these books. So there is just a growing readership for these types of things. So the first literary movement to emerge here is called Romanticism. Romanticism, in many ways, is a response to both the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. People are being viewed as individuals in romantic works. It's focusing on the emotions of the people and nature and sort of how beautiful things are. This often gets coupled with the idea of nationalism, love of your country or love of your group of people. So these are sort of the major ideas. So one of the other pieces, and that's comes here with this idealizing of nature. A lot of times romantic books or romantic pieces of literature focus on nature, right? So if this is a pretty famous romantic image, this guy standing on top of a mountain looking out over nature. It's a sort of, again, this love of your area. So some famous pieces of romantic literature, probably the most famous or one of the most famous, and the one that you certainly will become accustomed to, is Frankenstein, right? So Frankenstein, is the story about Frankenstein's monster, right? And Frankenstein is the person who has built this monster, and he is, as the story goes on, right, he has built something that he winds up regretting. The monster winds up killing members of his family and all these sort of terrible things. So while all that's happening, right, you're focusing on focusing on love, right? The monster just wants somebody to love. So it's, again, focusing on these emotions. Frankenstein is written by Mary Shelley. She's British. So there's these things here, right? You also have a guy named William Blake. So William Blake is a poet. He writes a poem called New Jerusalem, which we'll look at in a few moments. And New Jerusalem is a poem where he looks at sort of England's green and pleasant lands, dark satanic mills, right? Again, sort of criticizing the Industrial Revolution while playing up nature. The other person is Sir Walter Scott. So Sir Walter Scott is a Scottish author who writes a book about, well, writes a couple of books, but one talks about, again, this idea of heavy emotion, um, looks at the medieval ways of life and sort of, again, looking backwards. In response to that is you have realism. So realism is not necessarily focusing on sort of people's love or people's emotion. It's really looking at more of how are things going on for average people, right? It's a more of an examination of what are people experiencing. So realism portrays the life of workers, sort of the mundane. So these two images, again, these are artistic styles. So you'll see them in both literature and in paintings. Right. So you have this image, right? This gentleman sort of standing at the top of a mine, sort of looking tired and fatigued. And then you have sort of these other guys around him. You know, this guy's sort of slouched over, tired. Here you have a family sort of eating potatoes, right? Again, sort of what is the experience of these people? Famous approaches to this are, in particular, are Charles Dickens, right? So um, Dickens is probably most famous, right, for the story The Christmas Carol. And you're going to be looking at an excerpt from a book called Hard Times, which is a collection of a couple of his writings. It's part of a longer series of stories that he wrote. So as a literary style, realism looks at, again, how average people lived, and the point of realism here is to show sort of what is the experience of people in the Industrial Revolution. So if you think about this story of A Christmas Carol, right, you have Ebenezer Scrooge, who is manipulating or taking advantage of his worker Bob Cratchit. Cratchit doesn't get the ability to sort of go home for Christmas to see his son Tiny Tim or all that. And the sort of narrative of the story, right, with ghosts, pasts, present, and future, are sort of showing Scrooge all the things that he will miss out. And one of the things that's happening is, you know, you're trying to see that this guy has devoted his life to money while sort of nothing, you know, no good things are happening to him, right? He's giving up the love of his life and all these different things. Hard Times looks at the story of, you know, people who are working in the mines and in the factories. So you'll see that. This style of writing also becomes what is used by the muckrakers in the 1900s as journalists. All right, so no, that's the sort of realism and romanticism, right? You'll see that there's these connections, and there are tensions between those two. When we talk about economic systems, right, we talk about capitalism. And here we're talking about something called like industrial capitalism. So capitalism has been around for hundreds of years. It's not brand new in the Industrial Revolution. So capitalism isn't new in the Industrial Revolution. However, things do change with the Industrial Revolution. What you have happening here is that you now are looking at something called industrial capitalism. So you've had agricultural capitalism, you've had mercantilism, but those are specific to those types of industries, right? And industrial will be the same. Agricultural capitalism looks at the sort of the need for land, right? So you concentrate the land ownership in a smaller group of people, and that wealth gets maintained in that group, and you make policies preferential to agricultural work. For mercantilism, the same idea. You are keeping items for merchants, right? But here what you're doing is, so mercantilism, and I'll explain mercantilism, basically is the idea that you know, if I'm a rug seller, right, I try and buy rugs, you know, I buy 10 rugs at $100 a piece, and I turn and I try and sell them for $150 a piece, so that I spent $1,000 to get those 10, and now I make $500, so I can use another 1,000 to get some more and keep 500 for myself. Industrial capitalism changes. Industrial capitalism looks at the idea that there is an unlimited amount of wealth in the world, and you can use owning the factories and the modes of production to maximize your wealth. So wealth is tied to the labor and the production, not necessarily the material. In order to make more money, you need to reduce government costs, right? So this is anti-mercantilism. And a person who is probably most famous for this is Adam Smith. So Adam Smith is a philosopher in the mid 18th century who writes about the rise of industrial capitalism. He very famously talks about the division of labor, and he gives an example of the pin. But he also believes in laissez-faire economics. So laissez-faire is a French phrase which means to let alone or to let do. And his argument is the government doesn't need to maintain control over systems. The government instead should allow people to spend the money however they wish. So let the people do what they do. He's very much anti-mercantilist, right? He is living in London just on the eve of the American Revolution, and he's looking at the things that the British government is doing, and he is appalled at it. So he argues for reduced government intervention. Smith is really focusing on the benefits being the ability of the government to limit people's abilities, right? And he sees that as terrible. So what he's seeing is the way for us to maximize wealth is by allowing everybody to spend the money however they want, and with very little government intervention. Now, he's writing this at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. As a response to that, you have socialism. So socialism as an idea emerges in the early 1800s, so 30 or so years after Smith writes his most famous book in 1776. And what happens as a result is there's massive economic inequality. People are poor, being exploited. So socialism emerges to respond to that, trying to get better treatment for the people and trying to limit or to level society for all. The goal here is to try and who should own the means of production, who should own the factories, and who should own the supplies. Should it be the individuals privately? Should it be the government? And socialists would argue that it should be collectively owned, and the benefits should go to all people. So the most famous here is obviously Karl Marx. So Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels write this book called The Communist Manifesto in 1848. And Marx and Engels argue that it is the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, the factory owners, and the proletariat who are always in competition. And that's what history is made up of, these two groups constantly battling. Now, he argues that the only way for the proletariat to really experience anything good is to overthrow the existing system. And Marx is obviously demonized in the current political environment, but his idea here is that the working class, the proletariat, have this class consciousness. They understand sort of the world as the proletariat. So capitalism and socialism have a big competition in the 19th century, and obviously still today.